Well, good morning, everybody, on this wet and windy morning. Today, you're in for a treat. We've got our first in 5 GMP webinars. So you're going to be completely GMP'd by the end of the week. In a moment, I'll hand over to Geraldine Brassett, who chairs the cross-industry GMP Equalisation Working Group. But first, I really just wanted to say a great big thank you from PASA and the directors and also the industry, because I think without all the hard work from all of the different working groups, I think we'd be in a very different place. Anyway, without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Geraldine, and your GMP Equalisation Week will be starting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Could we move on, Susan, to the next slide, please? Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here with you at the start of this week, and I'm obviously more fortunate than Kim because my rain has gone and my sun is shining. Must be something to do with GMP. So many of you will have seen this slide before, as it's the one I typically use when I do an update for the industry on the activity of the GMP Equalisation Working Group. I am going to sound a little bit like Kim, so forgive me, but every time I update this slide, I'm always genuinely blown away by how much the GMP Equalisation Working Group has achieved over what's actually been about 2.5 years. And by the number of people and their organisations who've given their time to help us with this. Like Kim, I believe the industry has benefited hugely from the work that has been completed. And I would like to add a personal thanks, because it's a big job chairing the group, to all the members of the GMP working group, the chairs of the subgroups, the members of the subgroup, and Lucy and the PASA team for all their hard work and support that's got us to this point. So I'm hugely proud of the amount of guidance that's been produced, but also, you know, the quality of that guidance and the benefit that I think it's brought. So in addition to the guidance listed on the slide, which is already available for you to use, I'm really pleased to be able to let you know that over this week we'll be releasing 2 more pieces of guidance. So today it's the second phase of the communications guidance, but I'm not going to say any more on that, as this is the focus of Louise's presentation. And then later in the week we are publishing some guidance on anti-franking. But as they say, our work is not yet done. We've still got the administration subgroup beavering away on the first set of Q&As, and the aim is to publish these during October. We also thought, having discussed this at the GMP Equalisation Working Group meeting, that it might be helpful to prepare a document that sits above all the guidance so that it's easier for you all to find out where to find particular pieces of help and information. So that work is also in progress, and we'll be doing that this year. I think if we've learned one thing working on GMP equalisation, it's that we know there is still the potential for solutions to evolve and new challenges to arise. So the group is continuing to meet on a regular basis to review what's happening with the projects, how trustees and schemes are responding, and generally where the market's going. And through those meetings, we can identify whether further help or guidance is needed. But as ever, if you spot anything or you identify a need, then please let us know, because obviously we'll do what we can to meet any gaps in the current guidance. So that's my brief update. I'm delighted that Lucy from TPR is able to join us today. Lucy and I worked together to set up the Equalisation Working Group, so now I'm going to hand over to her. So thank you, Lucy.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction, Geraldine. I'm Lucy Stone. I'm a policy lead at the Pensions Regulator. And if you can move to the next slide, please. I was reflecting on this about, now we have GMP Equalisation Week, I was reflecting on my very own GMP equalisation journey. And so the 27th of October 2018, when we started getting contact saying, oh, there's been this ruling, what's happening now? And it was really apparent that this was going to be a very, very big piece of work for industry, which had the potential to be substantial to some savers. And while with anything like this, there's also a risk about people developing lots of different ways of doing things, getting conflicting advice, and effectively the burden being much worse than it could be. So we were absolutely delighted when PASA sort of offered to chair that group, which really brings together people from across industry. I'll come to that in a second. For us, the initial focus when we first got the ruling, it was basically to manage expectations, and we wanted to send a clear signal to say, we know this is complicated and we know this will take time. We know you're not going to do it overnight. So because people were slightly worried about how we'd react, and the impact, for example, on CETP transfer times, and then as the second bit we thought is, okay, well, how do we get industry get through this, given what I've said about there's a very real risk of conflicting advice and excessive burden, etc. So Geraldine and I chatted, and PASA offered to chair this group with input from lots of different industry bodies, and so the group was established, and I had a little bit of a count. There's the guidance that Geraldine referred to. There's 7 pieces of guidance, 281 pages of content, which may sound like a lot, but actually for something as complex like this, I think that's pretty concise. And a total of 65 contributors are listed, and it ranges across the piece. There are lawyers, there are actuaries, there are trustees, there are lots of administrators, and all coming together. And I have to say, I know there's a bit of a theme here with what Kim and Geraldine have said, but I'm very impressed, and the regulator, it's great that we can then stand behind this and say, look, industry has produced guidance to help industry. This is, you can look at all these pieces of guidance and be confident that you are doing something sensible if you progress in line with the guidance that's been put out. And I think it's been a really good example of how industry can help industry, because as new topics emerged, new sub-working groups were set up, a new piece of guidance were produced, so that all the areas were considered. And Geraldine has said, if anything else emerges, I mean, there's more work coming, Q&As, but if anything else emerges, the group will be there to support. So I think it's been a really outstanding example of kind of industry-led problem solving and everyone working together collaboratively. So that's the sort of my reflections on the journey. I thought it might be worth for the audience setting out what we expect now. So obviously it's been 3 years, and while at first our messaging was very much around, we know this is going to be really hard, we understand it's going to be complicated, there'll be guidance, industry is going to produce guidance. Now actually we've moved on a bit, because everything's moved on a bit, and actually by now trustees really need to have a clear path to GMP equalisation, and absolutely critically be talking to their administrators, because we do know there's a capacity issue in the administrator industry. And therefore it will take time for everyone to complete this work, but it is really important to be talking to the administrators or the parties who are going to be delivering the work to make sure that everything you can do has been done, and to schedule it in. So as I said, actions you can take or should have taken already by now, choosing a methodology, working with the employer if required, scheduling in, talking to an administrator about what's going to be required and when is a reasonable time to do it, taking into account any other project work you have underway and synergies there. Obviously looking at the data and preparing the data and trying to fill the gaps, and also communicating to members. Now that is a very difficult area, because this is incredibly complicated. It's complicated to explain to people who work in pensions, or who aren't complete specialists in this area. It's complicated to even get your head around if you are a specialist. So how do you communicate it to members? And the first piece of communication guidance put out by the working group was a really, again, an exemplar of what can be done in communicating really complicated, a really complicated topic in a really simple language to savers, and in particular was very save focused. And so we also welcome this next piece of guidance, which is again about how you communicate to members and what you need to do to communicate to members. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Lou Harris, who will take you through this new guidance that's being launched this week, and how you can communicate with your savers on GMP equalisation.
Thank you, Lucy. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session. So I work at Willis Towers Watson as a Senior Director specialising in pension communications, and I've been chairing the COM subcommittee, which formed in early 2020, which is quite hard to believe, actually, when you kind of think about the year or so that we've had. But we set ourselves a mission on the working party to really put the individual member at the centre of our thinking. And having developed the guidance launching today, we want to see that. We want to see that GMP equalisation, it may be very complicated and your communications really don't need to be. So we've split the guidance into two parts. Lucy mentioned there that we've already launched the planning stage, which was published back in August 2020. And today it's with great pleasure that I'm introducing the implementation stage of the guidance, which will be available to download immediately, I think, after this webcast. I think I'm correct in saying that, from the PASA website. And I'm sure the PASA team will be circulating links to that via social media, etc. So what I'm going to chat through in the next 20 minutes or so is just to share with you what's included in the guidance that's being published today, and to signpost what you're going to get out of that guidance once you've downloaded it. But firstly, I just want to introduce the working party and just say a huge thank you. You know, this is a really immensely talented group of professionals who volunteered their time to draft this guidance as part of their commitment for the industry. But other than to thank them for these contributions, I also want to take a moment to really make an important point about the constitution of the subcommittee, because anybody knows if you work in any communications, it often takes the inputs of many stakeholders to get a really fully balanced and holistic view of the facts and different approaches to get to a stage where you're comfortable with what will be published. And we've really got representation from all the professional disciplines that it takes to run a pension scheme. So we have legal, actuarial, company technical, administration, trustee, in-house comms, we've got comms consultants. And so this guidance really represents those collective outputs. And as you can see in our vital statistics, a minimum of 120 hours of combined expertise across a number of weeks. And I think that weeks point, the duration, is quite important, because when we're drafting this guidance, we're actually linking into the other working groups to see how their guidance is going and trying to align with each other. And not to mention, obviously, the copious amounts of teas and coffees and probably the odd glass of wine in there as well. And then when we draft it, we then submit it to the executive working group, which Geraldine chairs, and then it gets another round of assessment from more professionals. So I think that has a real value to it, because I think this really means that schemes can value this guidance as being robust, as being reliable and ready to use. So let's take a look at the guidance and what it actually covers. So just moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're building on the guidance already published for the planning stage. So there's actually lots of links in here to make it easy for you to cross-reference. We didn't want to repeat necessarily, so we've kind of cross-referenced. But particularly there's some reminders in here about some broad principles of communication. So, but then we get to things like, we've got two really useful infographics to help you think through the member's perspective and putting the individual at the centre of your thinking, so that you are considering wider what the context might be for members. We'll take a look at the timing, what the legal requirement might be, and what some best practice might be around timing. And in section 5, we cover some really simple segmentation, as all GMP comms projects will require you to think about who you're communicating to and why. At section 6, we get really practical and offer 10 big questions to prepare yourself for data to use in your communications. And then finally, we cover what does business as usual look like and some tips on housekeeping. But I just want to quickly recap on the guiding principles for communicating. So if you just move to the next slide, please. These principles can be applied to any communication channels, not just GMP. So you might find these useful in that respect. So just start thinking about these 3 stages to focus your approach. Any communications expert will be familiar with this, but what do you want members to know? What information is it that you're trying to get across? What do you want them to feel? It might seem a bit odd, but actually with GMP comms, feeling confident in how the scheme's being run is probably the most important aspect, because these members didn't expect any change. They've trusted in this scheme since they've been contributing to it. So how do you want them to feel about this communication activity? And then what do you want them to do? Is there a call to action? Do you want them to sit tight? Do you want them to get in touch? Do you want them to check their tax affairs? What is the call to action to them? So having that approach can help you really structure the focus around your communications. But then looking at some other guiding principles in a little bit more depth in the guidance, we talk about, it's good to consider how you layer information. So this is all about not overloading an individual and allowing gradual exploration of more detail if the member wants it, not kind of bombarding them. And using different channels that work for your members is worth considering, particularly by using channels that your members are already familiar with and trust. We'd encourage you to really think hard about if you do need to mention that. So, Lucy mentioned earlier that this is a very complex subject, and we behind the scenes are trying to get our heads around what it is. But do you really have to tell the member that? Do you really need to give them all of that detail? So with highly technical matters, we often fall into a trap of thinking that just because there's lots of information we have to share that, whereas actually less is so often more. Avoiding jargon. When we wrote the first guidance for the planning stage, we included jargon buster, and we actually thought that we might need to expand that in this guidance, but we've managed to not produce any more jargon. So actually in this guidance, we haven't got any more jargon buster points, so we're actually quite proud of that. Involving others, like your administrator in the review process, will really help you avoid comms which might cause concern and cause unnecessary noise. So getting feedback from other stakeholders in your process will be a really valuable thing to do. And then finally, just consider how this communication can maintain the trust of members. So what is it about the production of it, the style of it, the presentation of it that means that it continues to be trustworthy? So some good principles there for any communication. So now let's just take a little look at 2 infographics that you're going to see in the guidance that will really help you to focus on the member's perspective. So what you can see here is a classic change curve. Now, for anyone that's worked on any change or communications project, you'll probably be familiar with this. This is a model that you can use. And we've applied this to GMP equalisation in the guidance. And what it does is it plots the reaction that you may expect members to have over a period of time when they find out that something is going to change. And the purpose of the model is to plot your communication activity to address those reactions, to take them through that change with the least resistance as quickly as possible. And the target at the end on the right hand side, top right there, the little grey smiley face, is to get members through this change feeling confident in the trustees' approach to this. So initially they might be unsettled, you know, they may feel that the contact they've had or the uncertainty around this might be very unsettling for people. And the reaction might be that they might contact the administrator because they're feeling concerned. And that might be unnecessary concern. But then ideally, through the communication pieces that you plan and deliver, that you start to help members understand why things are changing, and then ultimately they start to adjust their thinking to that new circumstance that they're in. And for many members, you know, it'll be a very small change, and for some it might be slightly more. So this is the member's perspective, which is, you know, it's a really important starting point, and it's a real anchor for how you start to think about your communications. But then what about the wider context? You know, what do you know that's going on in your scheme? So if we just go to the next slide, you'll see, if we just go to the next, thank you, Susie. You'll just see this in the guidance, which will really help you to put the individual at the centre of your thinking. So as you can see here, we've got the member at the centre, and they're surrounded by other factors which influence their experience. So for example, you know, has your scheme taken members through any change previously? I think it's highly unlikely that any DB scheme at the moment has not done that. You know, the majority of schemes have now, you know, made some changes. You know, perhaps that's been a full closure to future accrual or a full closure to the scheme, or there might be changes to the benefits basis. But it's quite likely that they'll have been through some change at some point. Or do you have these kinds of changes happening at the moment? Are you in the middle of taking members through this? So factoring that in from the member's perspective and what that context means to them will be really important. You might also be planning things like PI exercises to combine with the GMP Equalisation project. So again, thinking about this from that context, you know, how do you combine that and how do you combine the messages? You might have already told members about changes due to rectification. If you have, you'll probably want to tie up the messages, because again, thinking from their perspective, did you signpost members to tell them that there might be something else coming further down the line around equalisation, for example? And how have you communicated with members historically? You know, are you the kind of scheme that is light touch and you know, doesn't really invest an awful lot of you know, design or comms focus around things and just wants to be compliant? Or are you the kind of scheme that has a full programme of engagement activity? And so the communications for your GMP equalisation really need to follow the same style and effectiveness of that kind of communication, so that it's familiar to members. And how long is it since you communicated with members? You know, for some deferred members, it may have been many, many years since they last heard from you, other than a newsletter, if you are sending a newsletter. So, you know, just think about, you know, is there a long period of time where members haven't seen a letter from you, they haven't received an envelope on their doormat? Will they recognise it? You know, will they recognise the branding that you might use? Will they trust it? You know, in this era of you know, pension scams and, you know, warnings about fraud and being vigilant, you know, will members trust what they receive? And what kind of workforce were your members or are your members? You know, what are they? Financial services? Are they retail? Are they manufacturing? You know, each type of workforce will have a very different level of financial knowledge, so that's a really important consideration. So having considered the member's perspective in your planning, you know, we've offered some guidance on working out the timing of the communication, because, you know, there might be many, many parts that you need to kind of consider and how you're going to bring that together for the member. So the timing will certainly be driven by the circumstances of your scheme. It's worth thinking about the order of the communications, particularly if you've got a lot going on. Now, obviously, linked to equalisation is rectification. So from a member's perspective, they are both possible changes which may be unsettling. So if you can, combining your communication is ideal. But if the timing between each of those is going to be too long, then you should really get in touch about rectification as soon as you can and signpost members to equalisation so that members know what to expect, and there will be more to expect. And then the pensions increase is an interesting one, as these have, they have an annual cycle which is pretty much set in stone. So from a communications point of view, it will either fit with your GMP equalisation timeline or it won't. So you'll really need to work out how your equalisation project timings will work with that annual pensions increase cycle. And you may need to let members know you're equalising or having equalised. In the timing section of the guidance, we've also included around the legal requirements, particularly around consultation if you're taking the conversion route. Now, there is a requirement to take reasonable steps to consult in advance in this situation. I just think we've lost the slides on screen, actually, Susan. I don't know whether you can bring them back up on screen. Thank you. There is a requirement to take reasonable steps to consult in advance of conversion, but this isn't prescriptive. There's no prescriptive timeline around that, and there is some flexibility for schemes to determine the approach. But what you should do really is take your appropriate advice to make sure that you're legally compliant. So we haven't set out a prescriptive approach to consultation or disclosure requirements, and we recommend that schemes refer to their lawyers as appropriate and work closely with their specialists. We've also talked about some around timing best practice. So, for example, you may want to inform pensioners as soon as you can, but for deferred members, perhaps you could take a different approach because they're not in payment yet. There's consideration of how to work timing of communication with your rectification project, which I mentioned earlier, and to manage expectations appropriately. And also thinking about what you might have already told members. So many schemes have already, talked about equalisation in their newsletters or their website. So just to, to manage expectations, because these projects can take a long time to deliver. And then finally, we touch on past transfers out. So it's unlikely to be practical for trustees to communicate with everyone who transferred out on an equalised basis, because you might not even have their addresses. So you may want to put a general statement on your website, if you have one, just to say that equalisation is complete, and also include contact details for that. So just moving on to who to communicate with. So if you just move slides, please. Just move the slide, please, Susan, if that's possible. So in the guidance, we've shown some really simple segmentation. We hope that this list is a great starting point for you to start shaping your communication approach. Even at a simple level, we've identified 11 groups which you'll need to consider. And you could use this list to start bucketing how many of your scheme members fall into each of those segments. And this is a really helpful way to size up the communication task, if you like, to see how many people you're going to have to communicate with. And as you can see here, there are two key groups. There are pensioners and there are non-pensioners, which is made up of active and deferred members. What I haven't shown on here, but it is noted in the guidance, is you might also have some former members or their dependents who died, to whom a GMP was payable, which means you may need to correspond with whoever is looking after their estate. And within all of these categories, you might also be able to identify some people who require some tailored information, for example, around people with tax protections, lifetime or annual allowance issues, or in respect of the tax treatment for back payments. There might be people with multiple records, GMP underpins, or members with a very large or small uplift. So there's definitely going to be some nuances, but this is a really good starting point of these 11 groups of people. So you're going to see who the groups of people are, but who to communicate with, but what do you need to say to them? So we've also included in the guidance, if you just go to the next slide, please, Susan, some help on what to say to members depending on their segmentation and some criteria. So we've used a really simple framework on the criteria, starting with the pensioner and non-pensioner segmentation, but then breaking it further down into whether or not you're taking a dual record or a conversion approach, if they're due an uplift or not, and if they're due a back payment or not. And these kind of groups start to create the reason that you would need to say things to people. So we've provided some common phrases and paragraphs and content headers for schemes that they can use in their communications. And we would really encourage you to work with this guidance to fully consider your own circumstances. But you can see here that there's some sample paragraphs which are kind of labelled A, B, C, D, for example. And you can use these to build communications in a simple, straightforward way. We didn't want to provide full templates because each scheme will be very different, but we have provided some sentences and paragraphs which we think are the simple way of saying what you need to say to members. There are going to be these more challenging nuances, and we have provided a full list of these. So I mentioned earlier there'll be some things like tax protections, for example, but also if you've got forfeiture clauses in your scheme rules, you'll have to cover that in the communications. And you might also have members with pre and post 1988 GMP. So you might need to think about how you talk to them in your communications. So, as you can see, it's practical, and we're going to get even more practical when we get on to data, the subject of data. Now, in most GMP projects, the focus on data has tended to be, not surprisingly, around the calculation aspect. But actually, when you start to implement GMP equalisation, there is a real requirement for data in order to be able to communicate. So please don't forget that in your project planning, because without data, we can't communicate. We can't identify those segments. We can't build different paragraphs into letters. We can't mail out to people. So it is really important that data is considered. So what we've done in the guidance is set out a really practical 10 big questions to prepare you for the data that you will need to communicate. And they may seem obvious, but they are best to be asked up front and agreed up front in the very early planning stages of your project. So for example, do you know what data items you will need to communicate? It might sound really simple, but do you know what you will have on your communication materials? So for example, on a really simple statement to members, you're likely to need a current value, the calculated difference, and the new value. And all three of those items might come from a different source. So are you prepared to provide these to whoever's producing your communications? And who will be responsible for providing you with that communications data? Will it be the administrator? Will it be the actuaries making calculations? Will it be a combination of those two sources? And what's the timing around that to enable communications to be produced? You know, are you going to communicate in waves to people because you've got a large membership or you've got quite complicated circumstances? Or are you going to mail out to people in one go? And how will the data support you in that approach? Where will you store the data, and where will you store the communication outputs, for example, for an audit trail? And can the data be provided at a push of a button, or will it need a method of production and checking to be able to provide it? And does your equalisation project plan have data provision on it as an explicit line within owner on that project plan? So to help you with all of that, we've included a really an interactive checklist for data as well. So if you just move to the next slide, please. So if you download the guidance, you can use this useful checklist on your project. So where you can see the little grey boxes on here, you can actually click these on the PDF and tick them off. So whoever's working on your project from the data perspective or the communications perspective, you can use this as a practical tool. And then speaking of interactive checklists, if we just go on to the next slide, we've also repeated the interactive checklist that we included in the first set of guidance, which was for the planning stage, which is really helpful to help you assess all of your communications to make sure that your housekeeping is in good order. So, for example, things like your website, your administration letters, you might have retirement packs, pensions increase letters, etc., etc. And this really is a helpful way to audit what you've got, just to make sure that everything post-equalisation is planned and organised from a communications perspective. And then finally, just on to the next slide, please, Susan. You know, Lucy mentioned there that at the very start that, you know, as an industry, we've all been trying to understand what this means and how to approach it. From a comms perspective, we hope that the two sets of guidance that we've already produced and the one that's available from today will give you that basis to be able to start planning from the communications perspective, to be able to get this done for members. You know, give yourself sufficient time to plan and to check everything, even if you're not going to be communicating for, you know, months ahead, because, you know, there's still work to be done around data and calculations. The communication aspect, the further you plan it in advance, the more smooth it will be. And then also just keep it simple. You know, GMP equalisation is very complicated, we know that. But your communications don't need to be. So we hope that the guidance is helpful. If there is feedback, obviously we'd welcome that. The working group will regroup if it needs to address any feedback. But without further ado, I think I'm passing you back to Kim, who I think is going to take us through some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Lou. I think what Lucy said earlier about GMP equalisation is a really good example about industry helping people, industry helping industry. And I think that it does set a precedent for the future. So let's hope that we can continue to do so. Also, Lucy talked about, you know, maybe communication, you might already be in the middle of all the technical stuff. You might not have even decided what method you're going to be using, and communication might be somewhere off in the distance, but you should still be planning and booking that slot. You know, there is probably going to be a lot of schemes wanting to do the same thing at the same time. So you need to make sure that you've got it fully integrated, and communication, as both Lucy and Lou said, is absolutely vital. You know, so although this is a hugely technical area, you know, we could get caught up with it in the complexity, but GMP equalisation is affecting real people, and for some it could have a significant impact on their lives. So we have to remember that people must be central to our thinking when we're planning and executing our GMP equalisation. And as Lou said, you know, if their pension is changing, you need to tell them. You need to tell them in a way that they understand, so they don't lose trust. You need to move them through that through to acceptance on that journey that Lou was talking to you about. Do they need to do anything? You need to tell them if that's the case. And I really think the grid is going to be really helpful, because it effectively drives what you need to do. And I don't think any PASA or PASA-led webinar can go by without talking about data. Those 10 big questions, whether or not they're simple, I think all of us have seen and experienced times when just because something is simple, it gets forgotten. So having that grid about what you need to do, answering those 10 big questions, even down to the current value difference and new value, can they be merged into the one letter that you want to send out? It does seem to me that there's some really sensible guidance within this, and whilst it might not be talking about the legal complex aspects, it is how it's your window to the world. It's your window to the people who are members of your pension scheme. So definitely, I would recommend that you download the guidance now, and make sure that both communications and data have their own line in your project planning, and that they have their own sort of project lead in terms of ownership. I can't see any questions come up yet, and that possibly means that it's been so clear that, oh, I can see one now. I could take it. Oh, yes, I think because Lewis said that you could take a question on what the calls to action might be, and I think that would be quite helpful. Could you do that, please, Lou?
Yeah, I think one of the one of the points around communicating GMP equalisation is you could think of it as it's a bit of a tell. This is what we're doing, this is why we have to do it, and this is the result for you, and that's that. But actually, there are a couple of circumstances where there might actually be a call to action for the member where they have to think about something and do something. One example of that would be if you're, and I know some schemes that I'm working with or aware of are combining this with the PI exercise. Now, in that circumstance, obviously the member has options and choices to make. So in that scenario, leading the communication with the PI offer is probably the predominant message rather than GMP equalisation message. So, what you're actually doing is informing the member that they've got this option, this choice. Oh, and by the way, at the same time, we've had to do this thing called equalisation because we have to. It's it's legislated, and we have to do this. So that's just one scenario that is a call to action. And then another one is particularly around tax protections. Now, obviously, not many members have tax protections, but asking members to check that. You imagine that you might have retired 5-10 years ago, and you think you've dealt with all of your tax affairs, and then all of a sudden you're being asked to just tax is your responsibility. It's not trustee's responsibility. You have to check your own tax affairs. Do you have protection? Please tell us. That kind of call to action can be quite unsettling for members because they've then got to dig out all of their old paperwork and just remind themselves what their financial planning position is. So that's just a couple of things that can come out of the projects that you work on.
It's really that's a really useful thing, because I know we've seen schemes combining GMP equalisation with other projects, but we do have one question. I think it's probably one for Geraldine, actually, if Geraldine's still here, and it's one basically saying, will PASA, and probably we're talking about the industry-led group, try and capture information on how schemes are adopting good practice offered in the guidance. sort of almost as Lucy said, this sort of exemplar of how to do things right. Will we be capturing anything like that?
So we aim, so I am still here, we aim to obviously capture feedback through our regular meetings. We see feedback, so I often see, documents produced by organisations where they're quite clearly based on or referencing the guidance. But we have often thought about doing a more formal sort of feedback approach, whether that's through a survey, or whether it's through some sort of request for feedback. And I do think now, or perhaps early in the new year, would be a really good time to do that, because what we want to do is continually produce and improve on information for the industry. And as I say, we know it's not going to stand still. So through the group, we do take feedback, but I do think there would be value in perhaps doing something a little bit more formal once the industry's had these last couple of pieces of guidance that we're about to produce for a few months, to have a look at them and see how things are working. So Kim, perhaps that's something we can put on our list.
Well, the list has been a very long one, so I think
it has been a very long one.
Yes, I think that'll be really useful, because it's, I think often you find sort of schemes, they want to know how they sit within, compared to their peers as well. So that would be quite useful. I've got a question in for Lou now. A couple of them I can actually sort of answer, because the guidance will go up on the PASA website probably later on today, if it's not there already. And generally it will be accessible through, as I think Geraldine said, through social media. This session is being recorded, so hopefully you will be able to get access to it, should you want to be able to listen to it at another time. But how do you think that, sorry, Lou, how do you think that people will be able to use this guidance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we, as a working group, when we started, deciding what approach we were going to take, we wanted to make sure that everything that we produced was really practical and easy to use, because ultimately this is to help people. We didn't want it to be just a download of facts and information that people had to then digest. We wanted some really practical tips. Yeah. So I think the first thing is, if you've got people on your project that are or in your team that are going to be involved in communications, I would suggest that they download and read both sets of comms guidance. They're not long documents, they're really short. We've designed them in a way that feels easier to digest the information, because it is about communications. So I would suggest that is a really good starting point. And then, perhaps the checklists are a really good place to start as well, because they do start to help you start thinking about what your communications approach might be. So that would be my starter, I think, starting point.
Good stuff. Thank you, Lou. I've got a question here for Lucy about the Pensions Regulator, and it said, Maria's asking, does TPR have a clear timeline for scheme compliance with GMP equalisation?
The short answer to that is no. The long answer to that is it's quite complicated, because obviously this is an issue that goes back a very, very long time. So on the one hand, this needs resolving. It's been ongoing for too long. And some of the people affected will be, maybe advanced in age. So they need their benefit, if they're entitled to more money, they should get it as soon as possible. That being said, we also know there's a capacity issue in industry, and it's going to take a while for the administration industry to be able to schedule people in and deliver this work. So I think it's about understanding what the priorities are and maybe trying to target those particular savers where there might be more of a sense of urgency, if you can, both individually at scheme level, but also within industry. It certainly can't go on forever. The other thing to be mindful in terms of timeline is you have other initiatives coming. So people who are trying to de-risk, for example, we want to resolve this as soon as possible. And also the pensions dashboard is on the horizon. You know, the call for input put out by the pensions dashboard program was talking about scheme staging from 2023, and really you want to be able to reflect an accurate value to your savers. So that's the long answer.
Well, that's a perfectly reasonable long answer, I think. It goes back to what you were saying right at the very beginning, Lucy, which was the, you know, do what you can now. Don't wait, and make sure you book your slot in, basically. There's also, I think there's a question here for Lou, and what it was saying is, so I'm looking at the different questions. Is it easier to communicate everything together, or one project at a time? You know, GMP rectification, GMP equalisation, PI, etc. So, you know, what does it go to information overload, or do you think we should be talking to people about everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that question, is it easier? I think there are lots of logistical things that you have to work around, which aren't easy. But from a member's perspective, I think trying to combine these pieces of information together is helpful. But if you can't combine them together, signpost them, because, you know, if you know that you're doing rectification, and then you're obviously going to do equalisation, and you might do a PI, or you might do something else. If you know these things, signpost them. Don't do them in isolation as if and pretend that they're not happening, because from a member's perspective, that's not helpful. So I would certainly try and join things up if possible, so that it's succinct. That would be my preference, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a question here from John, and he's talking about a scheme that's gone through rectification. They've done reconciliation. They're a leader in PI. So how can they communicate with members to help them, having already been through all of those changes to pension benefit? So, you know, what you went back to going through that sort of timeline to acceptance and trust. So how can schemes that have been through all of those different changes, or members have been through all those different changes, how can schemes communicate with them in such a way to maintain that trust?
Yeah, I mean, my response to that is, I'm just thinking, you know, how were those particular communications framed to members? You know, there's always an opening paragraph as to, you know, to say, why are we communicating with you? You know, is there some rationale from the scheme that you can repeat? So you've got kind of a repeating narrative that might run through all of these things. So, you know, that's important. And it sounds like if John's question is, you know, that they've led on PI exercises, I would imagine that a lot of effort and energy has gone into those communications by virtue of what they are. So kind of repeating some of that narrative in there would help. And it is about, you know, it is about maintaining trust. You know, schemes didn't know they had to do this. It's not like, you know, not like you've been kind of not transparent with members. It's, you know, it's a requirement that all schemes have to comply with. So I think, you know, talking about in your communications, talking about, you know, why you have to do this, and that all schemes are in the same boat, and, you know, we're working towards making this fair for everybody, can, you know, really allay people's potential mistrust of how schemes, you know, how schemes might be run. And I think I would kind of go down that line with it.
Yeah, that sounds very sensible, and actually it links into another question that's come through from Heath, which was really saying to you, what is the most important thing to remember when communicating to members, which you could apply to all forms of communication, not just GMP equalisation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to be simple, keep it human.
Yes.
You know, the language we use around pensions is so not human. You know, even the word equalisation is, you know, it's not the kind of thing you'd hear people chatting about in the supermarket over their shopping trolley. So, you know, just try and keep it really human, keep it as simple and straightforward as you can, and not overcomplicate it. Is always, you know, always the recommendation. And, you know, think about what, you know, back to that think, feel, that know, feel, do. What do you want people to know? What do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to actually do? You know, what is the call to action? You know, if it's you don't need to do anything, say that.
Yes.
You know, we're telling you this, but you don't need to do anything. So, you know, stick to those 3 principles, I think, across any communication approach. And the segmentation piece is really important, because what you're doing there is working out what's relevant to people, you know, so that you're not treating everybody in the same way. You know, you don't need to tell people about, you know, anti-franking if they haven't got it. So, you know, be targeted in the way that you build your communication material.
I think that's absolutely crucial, Lou. It seems that it's a big job that the industry's got and the schemes have got to communicate, but it isn't impossible. And if they plan well and they're organised, and I would say that they don't necessarily have to. It doesn't have to be glossy communication. It's obviously it's like you were saying, it has to sort of fit in with the way that they communicate. But the other point that you made is about making our communications human and making people central to that communication. I think that's absolutely vital. We've got just 2 or 3 minutes left. Is there anything, you know, if I wanted to say in just a couple of words, say 30 seconds, what would you be saying to schemes now? Each of you, Lou, and then Geraldine, and then Lucy. 30 seconds each.
From a comms perspective, I would be saying, get it planned, even if you're not going to communicate for many months. You know, don't make it the last thing. Make it the thing that you think about now.
Perfect. Geraldine?
I'm going to reiterate the message around planning, but probably, you know, all details of the project. Recognise there's a lot of demands on time, but it will be your time as well as we move into dashboards. So, you know, let's focus on the planning, do what we can, but know when we're going to do the rest.
Perfect. And Lucy, from a regulatory point of view, what would you say?
So I would say, remember, this is all about the saver. The saver is the heart of what we do, both as a regulator and you as an industry. So savers deserve this. It deserves to be done. You have a lot of guidance available to you now to help you get moving. So you really should be on the path to equalisation.
Perfect. I think even might give you back a minute, everybody, because I think that with those final thoughts, that's what we'd like to leave you with. And I'm sure that tomorrow, for our next GMP equalisation session, that will be much, still more food for thought. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much, our panelists. That's Lucy Stone from the Regulator, Geraldine Brassett, who chairs the cross-industry GMP Equalisation Working Group, and obviously Lou Harris, who is chair of the Communications Group. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.